Hello Internet, welcome to All Things Canadia, the Canadian show not about hockey. My name is Yusuf Hanna, and today we're going to talk about Canada. The first thing today that we're going to talk about is immigration. The reason immigration is important is because about 20% of Canada's population belongs to a visible minority. The largest visible minorities come from East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. In addition to this, there's a large Indigenous population in Canada that makes up about 4% of the Canadian population. Aboriginal affairs will be handled in another video, hopefully. So, immigration is handled by the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, and current minister is Minister Jason Kenney. Canada accepts three classes of immigrants. The first class is refugees. It's pretty straightforward. If your country's at war or there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be persecuted in your home country, Canada will accept you on a humanitarian basis, seeing as getting killed really isn't a good thing. The second type of immigrant is a family class immigrant. This means that someone has immediate family in Canada and they would like to immigrate. If someone in Canada has parents, children, spouses that live away from Canada, they can invite them to Canada and they would be immigrants in the family class. One of Canada's immigration goals is family reunification. Now, the third type of immigrant is the working class immigrant, and this makes up the majority of immigration in Canada. And the working class immigration section can be broken down further into the skilled and the experienced. Skilled workers and skilled traders are people with demonstrable experience who can bring labor and capital to Canada. Now, there's a second class under working class called the experienced class. These are people who would come to Canada with $1.6 million of legally acquired assets, and they would have to invest at least half of that money in a Canadian business or start a business with that money. To qualify as an immigrant, you have to meet a certain number of points, and you get points by language skills, education, health, experience, etc. Of course, there's an ongoing debate about whether immigration is a good thing or a bad thing, so I'm going to argue for both sides. Well, Yusuf, why is immigration good? I'm glad you asked. It turns out that immigration brings labor and capital into Canada, and those are things that we need. If more people are in Canada working, they pay more taxes. Those taxes increase revenue for the government. One offsided fact is that the likelihood of a low-income immigrant to live in government housing is lower than the likelihood of a low-income Canadian to live in government housing. On the other hand, why is immigration bad? I'm glad you asked, Yusuf. Well, it turns out that immigrants also consume more in government services. A study by the Fraser Institute shows that unemployment rate is higher in immigrants, and immigrants consume more in government services like welfare, education, and healthcare. The two broad goals of immigration in Canada are an increase in Canada's wealth and well-being, as well as humanitarianism. The current government is clamping down on immigration as a whole, and the influx of immigrants to Canada has steadily been decreasing. Another interesting fact is that immigrants aren't the only ones with accents in Canada. Canadians have their own very special accents, and I'll put a link to some very interesting stuff down below. And the second thing we're going to talk about today, we're kind of going to switch gears. We're going to go into foreign affairs. Canada has historically been a country of peacekeeping. Canada has participated in just about every peacekeeping mission the UN has had since the UN was the UN. My personal favorite story was the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egypt in 1956, prompted an Israeli response that was supported by the British and the French, but it was kind of in secret. And what happened was the Canadian Minister of External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson, actually went to the UN and convinced everyone in the UN, while the entire world was against him, that this plan was very treacherous and they were stealing proper Egyptian land, but no matter, Israel would win it back in 1967 anyways. So, Lester B. Pearson that year brought peacekeeping troops into Egypt, into the Sinai Peninsula, to split the Israeli and the Egyptian troops. That way the war wouldn't continue. That year he would win the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was later elected to be the Prime Minister of Canada. Historically, Canada hasn't fought in a lot of wars. The last war that was fought on Canadian soil was the War of 1812, and we all know who won that one. Psst, it was Canada. America won't admit it because Canada wasn't even a country yet. Canada has only been involved in 3 wars that take over 10,000 people, and they are World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, and if my memory serves me right, those were all pretty big deals. Other than those 3, Canada has participated in 3 wars as well as 3 rebellions/revolutions. The most recent revolution Canada has sort of been involved with was the Libyan Revolution in 2011, where we sent a couple of ships and a few planes. And the most recent wars we've been involved with were the Gulf War in 1990 and the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan, of course, started in 2001 and continues today, although Canada ceased its combat role in 2011. Nevertheless, Canadian troops continue on peacekeeping missions around the world, not only in Afghanistan. Now, on the other side of foreign affairs, there's foreign aid. Canada also gives about $3 billion in foreign aid through the Canadian International Development Agency. About half of that money goes directly to countries and half to organizations. The largest recipients are Haiti, Afghanistan, Mozambique, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Mali. The organizations that I'm talking about, of course, are things like the United Nations World Food Program. Canada belongs to a number of multinational organizations, including the United Nations, the G7, the G8, the G20, and La Francophonie. Canadians, of course, are humanitarian and, for lack of a better term, seek to make the world a better place. Of course, if we're talking about foreign affairs, we can't ignore modern trends like the trend of globalization. The entire world is trying to open up to new markets through things like free trade. As opposed to the protectionist policies of days gone by, as in tariffs on goods crossing borders, Today there's a trend of free trade, meaning people can trade across countries without paying an extra tax to the country. This is a big deal because businesses in a country now have larger places that they can be supplied from and larger people that they can sell to. It's also good for consumers because consumers get competition from foreign countries, that way they don't have to keep buying their domestic products at the prices. The argument against globalization, especially in Canada, however, is that foreign companies tend to bankrupt Canadian companies when they're more efficient. And they generally are. Canada is notoriously expensive. Now, not as expensive as Europe, mind you, but at the same time, Canada isn't as efficient as a country like China. Canada makes very high quality goods and it requires very high quality materials to do this. If we were to open ourselves up to free trade with the world, Canada would be dead. Let's say I'm a company that sells bubble wrap. I'm a Canadian company that sells bubble wrap in Canada and I get my bubble wrap from a supplier in Canada at a high price, and it's very good quality bubble wrap, and I sell it to consumers at a reasonable price now so that I make enough profit. If Canada were to open free trade with China, for example, there would be about 1,000 other bubble wrap companies that were making much lower quality bubble wrap, and they could sell it for much cheaper now that there weren't any taxes on it. If that was the case, Canadians would only buy Chinese bubble wrap, and the Canadian bubble wrap company would go out of business, and the Canadian would be out of work, and then Canadians would be out of work. Nevertheless, Canada has signed a number of free trade agreements in the last 20 years, the most famous of which, of course, is the North America Free Trade Agreement in 1994. It is important to note that the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement is the largest trading partnership in the world because those are both huge economies. Canada and America are each other's largest exporter and importer, and traditionally, with the exception of Richard Nixon, Canada and the United States have been on very good terms. Except for that time, Prime Minister John Sparrow Thompson said, "These Yankee politicians are the lowest race of thieves in existence." And again, 80 years later, President John F. Kennedy said, "Geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom nature hath so joined together, let no man put asunder." Other free trade agreements include Israel in 1997, Chile also in 1997, Costa Rica 2002, the European Free Trade Association in 2009, Peru in 2009, Colombia in 2011, and Jordan in 2012. Half of these were done by the current government, and there are 14 ongoing negotiations for free trade. Canada's standing with foreign nations, unfortunately, has decreased significantly. An important indicator of this is that in the last United Nations Security Council elections, Canada lost its seat. Nonpartisan research facilities have blamed two main things for this decrease. The first being the handling, or rather mishandling, of the environment by the current Canadian government, and the second being that Canada hasn't pursued foreign affairs like it used to. It's been pursuing trade missions mostly. So Internet, I want to get your opinion on this. Do you think Canada's focus on trade is a bad thing or a good thing? Finally, the last part of this video is about defense. I mentioned briefly the wars Canada has been in, and the only country in which Canadian troops are deployed in large numbers today is Afghanistan. Of course, Canadian troops are in peacekeeping missions all over the world. There are 68,000 active personnel in the Canadian forces, as well as about 50,000 reserves. Only about 1,200 of these are currently deployed. The Canadian forces are split into the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Air Force, as well as the Royal Canadian Navy. The Department of National Defence is headed by the Minister of Defence, Peter MacKay, and two people are responsible to Peter MacKay. The Deputy Minister of Defence, who is currently Robert Fonberg, is the head of the Department of National Defence, and the Chief of the Defence Staff is Thomas Lawson. Both these people are responsible to Peter MacKay, the Minister of Defence. Defence takes up about 8% of Canada's budget, which isn't too bad compared to America's 20%, and Canada's defence strategy is called Canada First. Canada wants a strong, modern, standing army with modern equipment. And since the Cold War, Canada's had outposts all over the Arctic and all over the coasts, however they're rarely used. The last time the Canadian Army was deployed on Canadian soil outside of emergency relief was during the October crisis of 1970. I hope to do a video on that one as well, however it was a whole mess of affairs, so I don't know how that would work. Our Canadian fun fact of the day is that one of the most traditional dishes in Canada is poutine, which is thin-cut fries with curd cheese and brown gravy. Thank you for watching. I hope you've learned something today. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And Internet, I'll see you next week.